I think it is important to put on the table the fact that there has been progress. First, much more explicit recognition about the costs and consequences of corruption on development, on poverty reduction. We know much more also as to the extent to which corruption basically is a break to development, is a break to private sector development. We call it the governance or anti-corruption dividend when some efforts and reforms are made, where there is a development dividend which we have calculated to be and suggested is about 300% in terms of income per capita, increasing by threefold if there is an improvement in anti-corruption in a country. Much progress has been made also in acknowledging that the private sector has a major role, a major responsibility in this area, both domestically within countries, but also internationally in terms of multinationals. OECD Convention is just one example among many. There are many other initiatives, including of many of the organizations represented here, including the PACHI effort and so on. Collective action in this field matters and matters enormously. The World Bank has been working with other partners, including the UN, including PACHI, in the forum, obviously, in this area. So collective actions and the recognition that collective action is crucial is another sign of progress. In fact, the whole private sector, in the private sector, the whole area of business ethics has become a higher priority among many, even if it's not yet universal, and it's important to recognize that. More generally, in terms of progress, both the public and private sectors have made inroads in taking initiatives and implementing some reforms for improved accountability and governance over the past decade and even more, and on anti-corruption, obviously. We have learned much in the past decade. There's enormous amount still to be learned, but there has been significant lessons from experience, many of which are being shared today. Some are in the Focus publication as well. But at the same time, when we look very carefully at the data, the evidence, at the research that we and others have done, the progress is checkered. It's not universal. It's not yet dramatic in terms of improvement in the area of anti-corruption in general, and in particular in terms of the interface between the private and the public sectors. Domestic firms still are engaged to a large extent, significant extent, even if it's not the majority in most places, in bribery for procurement and for other reasons. The same applies to multinationals. There's still a significant proportion of multinationals that do engage in this type of practices. Again, the evidence suggests that perhaps is not the majority in emerging economies are engaging in that, and one could argue that that's cautiously good news, but there's still a non-trivial proportion that is engaging in this type of practice, not abetting good governance in that context. So it is worth at this stage to also pause for a second and review the challenges ahead. I would not be truthful in saying that I can claim to have the list of what are the main challenges. That's for a much broader discussion among many experts. I would like just to take this opportunity to put a handful or so of challenges before us for further discussion, which should be taken against the perspective of progress that should be acknowledged that has been made and which I just mentioned. So let me mention a few areas of challenges that are still remain, that are unresolved, that are still open to debate. First, let me label it as the single bottom line challenge, and it could be under the rubric of back to the future. A lot of talk and writings and initiatives have taken place over the past years in terms of an expansion of the bottom line approach for corporations, from single to double to triple, and even beyond that, in terms of not only the profit motive ruling, but also social and environmental sustainability, corporate social responsibility, and so on. So there has been, in some sense, a proliferation of bottom lines. All these issues, obviously, ethics, sustainability in the environmental sense, corporate social responsibility, they're all important. But at the end of the day, let me posit that in the capitalist world, what rules is a single bottom line. And I think it's useful to go back to the basics and say ultimately a company will be accountable to either its shareholders or its family-owned business in terms of that principle. And being an economist, where incentive matters, that is going to be what basically drives their behavior and their major decisions. It could be more in the medium term and towards a longer term and not take only a short-term view, granted, and that's important, the issue of the term, but still, there's a primacy of that single bottom line. That gets us to the second point. If we accept the notion of a single bottom line, we need to give a hard look and perhaps a little bit of a re-look to the issue of incentives, much more focus on incentives. And there you can see already my bias as an economist. The question cannot be begged. Which one incentives will matter and which ones may not make the difference in terms of affecting the basic equation of cost and benefits of engaging in a corrupt act for a firm versus not engaging in a corrupt act. So that hard look to incentives may throw a somewhat different light in any initiative that we are undertaking in terms of evaluating its potential costs and benefits, and also ex post in terms of evaluating what worked and what didn't work. So, for instance, the regulatory environment obviously is very important for altering this equation, assuming, of course, that the regulations are enforced. So we need more discussion on enforcement, because it's relatively easy to suggest yet another set of regulations that need to be adopted by fiat, but very often they go unenforced. Further, it is important to also ask the question of cost and benefit of an enforced regulation. How to avoid the knee-jerk reaction, particularly following some corruption scandals, to go overboard in regulation that may backfire not only in terms of private sector development as a whole, but it may even backfire from the much more narrow perspective of more ethical and anti-corruption behavior. Let's keep in mind that excessive regulation can be a breeding ground for additional demands for bribery. So again, a hard-nosed look is always worthwhile from an incentive standpoint in terms of looking at this. Now, that gets us to the third point, because what could we look at much more in depth and focus as sometimes an alternative to this reaction, let's just regulate more when there is a scandal and when there is a concern about corruption. That alternative, and that's a third point, is transparency-related reforms, which in my view have not gotten the sufficient emphasis that it deserves. In some sense, it has been for too long the black sheep of such reforms. And we're talking here, for the sake of time, I will not go into details, but we're talking at least at the broad level, 3 levels. Transparency at the corporate level, and you know much more, and there's a lot of discussion and some initiatives that have been taken in past few years regarding that, and the stock equity markets requiring more such transparency for a variety of well-known reasons, and similarly regarding the banking system in that context. Second, so it's corporate and banking sector is one. Second is about among multilateral organizations, including our own. So it's regarding our own corporate governance and our own disclosure. No secret that while we have made some progress over the past 5-8 years, we need to make more progress. That's in general, but more specifically, also in terms of initiatives of disclosure, like for instance, the full publication, and it's all in the web, of the hundreds of corporations and individuals that have been sanctioned and are publicly sanctioned by the World Bank for having been involved in World Bank-funded projects in inappropriate or corrupt practices. That also applies not only to multilateral organizations, but this type of transparency initiatives and reform could apply also to initiatives taken by many more NGOs. We have discussed in the past, Transparency International could take stock of all these firms and corporations that are being delisted or put under sanctions regime publicly by institutions like the World Bank. Now EBRD and others are likely to come on board. So an institution like Transparency International as an NGO could be a depository of all such information and have implicitly or explicitly some ratings in that context, like they do regarding countries, but not regarding the corporate sector. So basically increasing the reputational cost due to corruption, that's an enormous incentive in terms of the cost side that could make a big difference. We need transparency reforms with spine, not rhetorical. And that gets us to the fourth point I wanted to mention in this area, which is absolutely crucial, but by staying too much at the narrow micro level, we lose the broader perspective. And that's media freedoms, in particular media freedoms and how they can relate to corporate and public governance, and also how it's interesting how research comes into the fore there. Basically, the capacity of some countries of engaging in a freer way in full disclosure through the media, coupled with the capacity of undertaking investigative journalism, can make a huge difference and raises enormously the reputational risk and therefore the reputational cost for the corporate sector of engaging in these practices. Similarly for the public sector and the politicians, and we have seen it, that cost in many examples. I'm sure many will come up in the context of industrialized countries and some in terms of emerging economies as well. My own country, Chile, is a good example in that context. In fact, it was a very interesting piece of research done recently by Russian researchers that looked, in fact, into the number of mentions in the press regarding abuses on corporate governance for particular companies, and they related it very strongly with more protection in terms of corporate governance for minority shareholders as compared with those that had not been investigated or mentioned in the press. So media freedoms in this context is very, very important, which gets us to the fifth challenge, all related, that I wanted to put forth, which is the notion that I started with, which is questioning ourselves very straightforwardly at this juncture. We're already in 2008. Many of us have been at this for quite some time. Let's say for a second that next there is very little broader reforms regarding on media freedoms, which are lacking in many countries in the world, and also on transparency-related reforms more broadly in terms of disclosure of assets by politicians, the whole issue of campaign contribution by the private sector, the whole issue we just referred to in terms of publicly listing firms and so on. if there is very little on these broader reforms, let me submit, for the sake of debate and argument today, that the impact of many of the initiatives that are being discussed today and that have been taken in this collective action initiative by many of us, more manuals, publications, voluntary codes of conduct, and so on, let me submit that the impact of that may be rather limited. If we don't implement the broader framework, these initial reforms, for instance, in promoting codes of conduct initiatives, may not bear the fruit. In fact, if we take seriously the single bottom line approach I just mentioned, rather than being all over the place with three or more bottom line, and we do think hard about incentives in terms of increasing the cost of corrupt activities, and we abstract for a second from political correctness, why would a voluntary code of conduct by an industry make a big difference in inducing the incentive of a company that does engage quietly in bribery in some countries to continue engaging in bribery in those countries quietly while adopting and signing these codes of conduct? Of course, this gets us to the very serious and obvious issues that many of you have been thinking and working on, including Transparency International, which has done excellent work on this, like third-party monitoring. Obviously, if there is third-party monitoring which is serious and biting, and there are sanctions for non-compliance, then the incentive changes. But if it's totally voluntary, and there is no third-party monitoring, or even if there is little sanction or publicity about that, so there is no reputational cost, then there is little effect. The point is that many of these more serious reforms with spine, including on the transparency arena, are resisted by many quarters. We get back to the incentive structure. There are too many vested interests in that. Why is there resistance to third-party monitoring? Why is there resistance to sanctions monitoring? Why is there resistance to this broader disclosure and transparency issues? I think at this juncture it's extremely important to discuss this frankly, so that it's not just an issue of continuing to muddle along with more signatories for another code of conduct, or more conferences, or more publications and more discussions about collective action, but without figuring out, is this making a difference, and how are we going to make a difference in the next stage? And then to end, in terms of these points of challenges, which by no means are all-inclusive, or I claim that they are all the most important ones, but it's to put some framework for discussion. Let me give one potent illustration from for the points made earlier as to how important it is to go beyond the easier and perhaps more superficial type of reforms. And that's something we have done quite a bit of research on, and this is the challenge of state capture of state institutions, capture of the state laws, regulations, and policies of the government and of the state by potented elite, private elites. The question, if in cases that exist, and that's quite prevalent, different degrees, but quite prevalent in many of the countries around the world, where those exist, many of these more micro type of initiatives that we have been discussing may not make the real difference, because of what may be driving the ultimate outcomes are more these overarching issues of capture, and therefore one needs to address the question, if that is the case in quite a few countries where we are involved, how best to address these issues of the role of some of the private sector, which in some sense undermine not only the governance of the public sector, but also undermine the thriving and potentially much more competitive medium, smaller scale enterprises, exporters, and so on, of the rest of the private sector in a country. And by no means I mean to imply that this is just a challenge in many emerging economies, or in some of them, but it's also a challenge in some industrialized economies. It's not for a multilateral outside donor organization like the World Bank, IFC, or others to resolve it, but I think in a context of today where there is more frank discussion about these many issues, they should be brought forward. And whenever we promote new or ongoing initiatives to go forward, to ask the question, well, against this broader background, will our initiative, where we are putting resources and so on, be making a big difference, or even a small but non-negligible difference, or not? We need to keep in mind that the vast majority of firms, and particularly that thriving, competitive, smaller and medium-scale sector, and as I mentioned before, the exporters, have a vested interest at the end of the day, in a collective sense, of a good governed environment, good governed both in the private sector and in the public sector. So ultimately they have an interest, but that does not mean that that's a reality today, or that every single firm is engaging in that issue. That's the collective action problem that is being faced. It's not necessarily the interest in every setting for every corporation, and particularly for some large vested interest in that context that collude with a few political vested interests. Thank you very much for this.